this podcast, I will introduce you how to compute confidence interval. Now, confidence intervals, here we want to compute confidence interval are population mean and confidence interval are population proportion. Now, confidence interval population mean have two different cases. If sigma is given, that means population standard deviation sigma is given. If this is the case, we will use Z distribution. And if sigma is not given, is unknown, so for this case, we will use T distribution. So now let's see the procedure. So confidence interval for mean. So first step, we want to compute sample mean. Now sample mean sometimes is given. Now if we have the data, then sample mean will be equal to the function average. Then put all the data inside parentheses. And the second step, we want to know what is confidence level. Usually it is 90%, 95%, or 99%. Now, and alpha will be 1 minus confidence level. So usually alpha is 5% or 1% or 10%. The third step, we want to compute critical value Z. Now Z will equal NORM SIMV. Inside parentheses, you input 1 minus alpha divided by 2. Now if sample size is greater than 30, or we said before, sigma is given. Now if sigma is not given, we will use the critical value will be a T distribution, so T equal TIMV. Now inside you put alpha and comma, put n minus 1. n minus 1 represents degree of freedom. In the next step, we want to compute margin of error, E. So E is Z times sigma over square root n, or E equal T times S divided by square root n. Now, if we use T distribution, because we don't know population standard deviation, so we will use sample standard deviation instead of population standard deviation. Now, after we have margin of error E, then we know our confidence interval will be sample mean minus E. That's for the left-hand side. Right-hand side will be sample mean plus E. So now let's see the example. So now here is the example. A random sample of n equal 25 has sample mean equal 50 and sample standard deviation equal 8. And we want to form a 95% confidence interval of population mean. So here we don't have data. We already know the sample mean. We already know the sample standard deviation. And sample size is very small, so we will use the T distribution. So now let's follow the procedure. Step 1, we want to get sample mean. Now in this case, we have given sample mean 50, so we put 50. And then what's the alpha? We calculate 95% confidence interval, so alpha will be 1 minus 95%. So in this case, alpha will be 5%, 1 minus 95%. So the critical value. Now critical value, this time we'll use a T distribution. So we will use equal TIMV. Now TIMV, inside we put alpha 5% and comma sample size 25 25 minus 1, that's the degree of freedom, so 25 minus 1. So let's review the formula is TIMV. Alpha is 5%, and then degree of freedom is 25 minus 1. So we will have critical value 2.06. So next one, we want to compute margin of error, E. So E will equal T times S. S is 8. 8 divided by square root SQRT, and N is 25. That's the sample size. So now E is 3.30. So the confidence interval left hand side will be sample mean. This is sample mean 50 minus E. And right hand side will be sample mean plus E. So the confidence interval is approximately 46.7 to 53.3. Now this is very simple examples. Now let's go back to compute the confidence interval of population proportion. Now for confidence interval of population proportion, first we compute sample proportion P. P is X divided by N. Now X is survey those people say yes. N is all the sample size. Second, we decide confidence level. Again, usually it is 90%, 95%, or 99%. Now, and alpha is 1 minus confidence level. Third step, we want to compute critical value Z. Now Z is NORMSIMV. We use 1 minus alpha over 2. The next step, we want to compute margin of error E. So E is Z times square root P times 1 minus P divided by sample size N. Now be careful when you put this function into Excel. Don't forget the parentheses. And finally, we have confidence interval P minus E for your left hand side and P plus E for the right hand side. Okay, now let's see the example. So now this example, we want to compute a random sample of 100 people shows that 25 are left-handed. We want to form 95% confidence interval for the true proportion of left-handers. So now in this case, N is sample size, which is 100. And then X is the number of left-handers, so we get 25. So the sample proportion, this will be equals X over N. So 25 over 100. So you get 0.25. Now alpha, this is 95% confidence interval. So alpha is 1 minus 95%. So alpha again, it is 5%. So critical value, this is Z distribution, so equal NORMSIMV. Now inside we put 1 minus alpha over 2. So we will get 1.96, very close to 1.96. So next, the error of the margin of errors. Now be careful, this is Z times square root SQRT. Then you have numerator. Numerator is P is 0.25 times 1 minus P. So this is numerator. Then divide by n. N is 100. So close it. Now let's see, we miss one parenthesis, so another parenthesis. So that's your margin of error, 0.08, almost 0.085. So now the confidence interval left hand side is equal to sample proportion minus margin of error, and right hand side is equal sample proportion plus margin of error. So the confidence interval of left-hander is between 0.17 to 0.33. So let me double check. That's 0.25 minus 0.848. Yes, that's correct. So be careful for confidence interval for mean. Now this example, because we don't know population standard deviation, so we use critical value, we use the TIMV. And if we know population standard deviation, then critical value will be Z distribution. So any questions?